So I have the pleasure to introduce Dave Lightfoot, who I've known for, wow, I think 12 or 13 years now. And so Dave received his bachelor's degree in systematic entomology from Oregon State University and his master and PhD degrees in insect ecology from New Mexico State University. Dave's research focus is on grasshopper and cricket taxonomy and ecology. He has conducted numerous arthropod inventory projects for national parks and monuments in the Southwest. Dave has conducted ecological research on grasshoppers and crickets with the National Science Foundation's Long-Term Ecological Research Program, or LTER, at many sites in Oregon and New Mexico. He is currently doing long-term research on grasshopper communities at the Jornada and Civieta LTR sites, and those began in 1990. His research with the LTR also focuses on long-term experimental monitoring studies of vegetation and animals, including research on climate change and arthropod and rodent communities in New Mexico and Mexico. Dave currently serves as a senior collection manager for the Museum of Southwestern Biology at University of New Mexico. And at the museum, he focuses on taxonomy, including descriptions of newly discovered species and new molecular phylogenetic classifications for grasshoppers and crickets. He also serves as a research associate professor and senior scientist for the biology department at UNM. Dave has worked as an environmental consultant since 1990, and his consulting work focuses on wildlife habitat restoration and habitat restoration long-term effectiveness monitoring. So if you have followed our webinar series over the past 2 weeks, you've learned about the importance of butterflies and bees to the grassland communities. And today we are happy to have Dave Lightfoot here to talk about other important grassland arthropods in New Mexico. So with that, I'll leave it to Dave.
Okay, well, thank you, John, and Miranda. Thank you both for inviting me to the series. This is a really interesting series. I'm glad it's happening, and I'm glad to be part of it. I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've been doing in New Mexico and the Southwest on arthropods in particular, and focus it towards the prairie grasslands of northeastern New Mexico. So the area that I'll be talking about today is basically the southern Great Plains. So the map on the left side, if you can see my cursor, it's moving around in the area of northeast New Mexico. And you can see that on the ecoregion maps, these are level 2 ecoregions, so the very broad ones. The region in northeast New Mexico is classified as South Central semi-arid prairies, or it's also often called short grass prairie. And it's a bit different from the prairies as you go north into particularly Colorado, northern Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. It becomes more mesic and tall grass to the east. So the prairie grasslands in northeast New Mexico, southeastern Colorado are really semi-arid and transitional between the grasslands of the Chihuahuan Desert to the south. And if you look at the ecoregion map at the bottom, you can see that there are a lot of biogeographic units throughout New Mexico and throughout the northeast part of the state. So it's not just grassland. There are other environments and biogeographic provinces in the area too. And I'll get into some more details about how that adds to the biodiversity. And right from the beginning, I would just like to point out some of the different types of habitats or environments that occur in the overall prairie landscape. So I know I used to think of prairie as being fairly homogeneous and relatively uniform. And it looks that way when you're driving across, like on I-40 through northeast New Mexico, and particularly when you get into Texas. But there are a lot of smaller habitats, microhabitats, and particularly a lot of different types of disturbance patterns on the landscape, which are very important for creating habitat and habitat diversity for arthropods, plants, and other animals. So the main type of landscape that we're talking about is just open grassland country. But within that, the landscape actually is variable. There are elevation changes typically. There are subtle soil changes, groundwater differences, and vegetation changes that match the soil and topography. And when you walk across a grassland, you often walk into different patches of vegetation dominated by different species. Some of the main causes of different habitat patches are disturbance by naturally by rodents, like prairie dogs, for example, used to cover the Great Plains, primarily black-tailed prairie dogs from Mexico all the way to Canada. And now they've been almost completely exterminated, 95% of their habitat or more and their distribution are gone. So there are really very few prairie dogs left on the prairie compared to what used to be there. And they are very important in providing habitat patches, disturbance patches. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And also kangaroo rats, pocket gophers. They really do produce a lot of micro disturbance or macro disturbance in the case of prairie dogs that can cover hundreds of acres, thousands of acres. So they are very important in creating patches, but not as important as they used to be because we've eliminated most of them. Other important disturbances are caused by domestic animals and native ungulates, historically bison, which used to interact and still are known to interact with prairie dogs as far as they like grazing on prairie dog towns because of better nutrient status of vegetation. Elk used to be widespread. There are still deer and pronghorn, but the main ungulates now on the prairie, including New Mexico, are cattle, which I'll get to in a moment. And wildfire used to be very important in the prairie, just like it is in forests or was in forests. And I think most people are aware of what's happened with fire suppression in forests over the last century. In prairies, fire is a natural part of the process of ecological succession, where the disturbance affects vegetation, it kills certain plants. A lot of other plants are adapted to come back and do come back. But fire has a very important role, not only in maintaining just natural succession, but part of that succession is also reducing shrub encroachment on prairie environments. Frequent fire is really important for keeping shrubs back, particularly at the seedling stage. And now the main disturbances on our prairies are primarily human disturbance. Livestock, cattle is the greatest by far. And I think probably most of you are very familiar with livestock disturbance on prairie grasslands. Fences associated with livestock, roads, and agricultural fields are really a big impact, particularly in the northern prairie, outside of New Mexico, in West Texas, and in places in Northeast New Mexico, but mainly because of a lack of water and rough terrain. Agriculture has not taken off in New Mexico like it has throughout much of the Great Plains. And then non-native species in general, but particularly plants, non-native weeds have very much responded to large-scale human disturbances, such as livestock grazing, and livestock feed has has contributed to the spread of many exotics from Eurasia and all kinds of disturbance. Most roadsides are dominated by non-native weeds now, which in some cases do serve a purpose for pollinators, for example, in providing forage, also just providing cover for some animals. But then agricultural fields really do pretty much take out an entire landscape of what used to be native prairie habitat with native species. So these are all just consequences of development of the West and the prairie by humans. It's something that's happening, and it's something that's definitely having an impact on the native plants and animals. So in addition to just open terrestrial grassland environments, there are also quite a few riparian and wetland environments in the prairie that we tend not to think about that much, because you generally don't see them much, but they do crisscross the landscape. And things like depression basins, wetlands, and playas are scattered all over the southern prairie, particularly in West Texas and even in Northeast New Mexico. And these natural wetlands and playas are very important for many different species that normally would not occur in the prairie landscape at all. And they're very important, for example, for winter waterfowl, and the wetlands are important for many types of arthropods. And then the rivers themselves and streams form floodplains, which have very different soils, water availability than the surrounding prairie, and many different habitats like sandbars, old river channels, oxbows, and various vegetation zones away from the river that reflect ecological succession from river channel disturbance. And then there are sand dunes in the prairie that are derived from sands that blow out of from riverbanks and dry riverbeds. And those are scattered around and provide very, very different habitats for animals, plants, and arthropods in particular. And then the rivers and streams themselves, ponds, lakes, there are a lot of aquatic insects that live in the prairie, again, restricted to these very particular habitats. They are very important, although not as common as the grassland itself. And then in New Mexico, in particular, we have a lot of hilly and rocky terrain with essentially the transition area from the Rocky Mountains and the Sacramento Mountains onto the prairie. And these rocky environments tend to be a little higher in elevation, and out in the prairie where there are rock outcrops and escarpments, they produce very important habitats for, again, species that would not be there. They're like island habitats for species that are more typical in the montane areas to the west. And for all of these types of environments or habitats that arthropods use, I want to point out on the bottom of the screen that natural disturbance processes are part of the landscape and are very important in providing a whole variety of habitats over time. And they really do, these disturbance processes do increase biological diversity quite a bit, and they are important. Okay, so with that in mind, as far as an overall, what I'm talking about, the region, the habitats in general, I want to just go over arthropods now. And we tend to think of insects when we think of arthropods. Insects and spiders, they're the most common ones. But if you look at the diagram on the left side of the screen, you can see that there are actually quite a few different types of animals in the phylum Arthropoda. And that includes trilobites, which used to dominate the earth back in the Cambrian period, and they're all extinct now, but they used to be the dominant multicellular life form on the planet for hundreds of millions of years. And then there are the Myriapodes that include centipedes, millipedes, and some other similar arthropods. The Cholicerates are spiders and horseshoe crabs, and we're all familiar with the spiders, and there are very many species of spiders, a huge group of predators. And then the crustaceans, which, you know, we all think of lobsters and crayfish and crabs. There are many native crustaceans in New Mexico. I'll show you some examples, some of these smaller freshwater crustaceans that we really don't see very often, but there are quite a few of them and many very special species within New Mexico. And then the insects, the subphylum Hexapoda, of course, are the largest group of arthropods and the ones that we tend to think of. And the pollinators that we do research on and that this series is about, the primarily bees and butterflies are part of this group, but they are a very small part of all insects. So the main characteristics of arthropods, just for review, is that they have segmented bodies. I think of them as robots. They're much like robots. And in fact, robotic design now tends to follow arthropod morphology. They have an external skeleton, and with an external skeleton, they undergo a process of metamorphosis, which is shedding their skin so they can grow, like reptiles do. In order to grow, the skin doesn't grow, their exoskeleton doesn't grow, but they grow, so they have to shed into a new skin or exoskeleton that is larger than the previous one. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. They have multiple appendages and compound eyes, and often they have several compound eyes or numerous compound eyes. And the grasshopper up here is a real good model, just showing all the different body parts. And below it, internally, they have an open circulatory system, not closed like we do. Otherwise, they have many of similar types of organs or organs that have a similar function. And the different body parts are actually very important in taxonomy. Different groups of arthropods have different types of external body parts, and we use those for classification purposes quite a bit. So just a quick overview on the arthropods. And as far as their role, their abundance on the planet, they are the largest group of living organisms on planet Earth, the arthropods. They far outnumber any other group of organisms, including protozoans and bacteria to this point. There's still a lot of those to be discovered, but there's still a lot of insects to be discovered too. So if we look at this pie chart, see the insects alone, just known described species account for almost 1 million species on the planet. And then the other non-insect arthropods, over 100,000 other species. And you compare those to chordates, which include mammals, they're only 43,000. And even vascular plants, there are only about 250,000 known vascular plants. So arthropods by far outnumber every other living organism on the planet, and well, in terms of species, and except for perhaps microbes, in terms of numbers of individuals as well. When you look at the insects alone, they are partitioned into a number of orders, taxonomic orders. The largest are the beetles, the Coleoptera. They make up about 40% of all insect species. And the Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths, primarily moths, there are far more moths than butterflies in species, are the next largest, and then Hymenoptera that include bees and flies, Diptera. And these are all advanced orders of insects. And then the more ancestral or primitive orders of insects tend to be smaller and have not changed that much since the, well, about 200, 300 million years ago. Whereas the more advanced orders have radiated considerably in the last million years or so. Okay, so one of the important aspects of all arthropods are their different types of life cycles, life histories that they have. Some arthropods are short-lived. Some, like termite queens and tarantulas, can live up to 30 or 50 years as individuals. But most insects live about a year. And there are two primary ways that they undergo metamorphosis or change from an egg to an adult insect. And one of those is called incomplete metamorphosis or parametabolous development, which is like a grasshopper over here on the left side, and mites and spiders also. But in incomplete metamorphosis, the eggs hatch into little juveniles that basically look just like the adults, but in insects, they lack wings, but otherwise look pretty much like adults. And then they go through usually about 6 different stages. And the last stage, when they shed their skin, they become an adult. They have fully developed wings that they pump up the tissue after they've molted. So anyway, the small juveniles are very much like the adults. And this is true for the non-insect arthropods too. They have this incomplete metamorphosis. Now, one real big advantage of that is it allows for a quick generation time. So for example, a spider mite can go from an egg to an adult laying an egg in a week. It's amazing, but they can, one generation can be a week. And then grasshoppers and most other insects with gradual development live about a year, but the juvenile stages typically occur early in the season, like in the early summer, and then the adult stages in the late summer. And then they overwinter usually as eggs that are resistant to cold temperatures or dry season in the tropics. But one of the big disadvantages to this type of life cycle is that it doesn't allow the different age classes to use different resources from the adults. In most cases, the juveniles tend to live pretty much in the same environments and eat pretty much the same types of foods as the adults do. They're just smaller. Now, the other type of metamorphosis that across all arthropods only occurs in the more evolutionarily advanced insects is complete metamorphosis. And the classic example of that is with a butterfly. So for example, this black swallowtail life cycle shown here, an adult lays an egg, the egg hatches into a larva, in this case a caterpillar, which is an herbivore and feeds on plant tissue. And the larvae go through several different stages, and then they go into what's called a pupal stage. And the pupal stage is a quiet period where there's no activity, no feeding, but where the body essentially transforms from a larva to an adult under a pupal cuticle. And after development within the pupa, when the time is right, the pupa emerges into an adult insect, in this case a butterfly, or the same happens with beetles, bees, wasps, all the higher insects do this. And if you look at the illustration of the Japanese beetle life cycle on the bottom, it really shows how over the span of a year, You go from eggs to larvae of different sizes that feed on roots of various plants in the soil, and then eventually pupate in the soil and become adults, which, unlike the larvae that live underground in the soil, the adults live above ground and feed on leaves and flowers of other plants and are active. So you get not only timing differences on resource use by the same species, you also get spatial differentiation in resource use by adults and juvenile stages of the same species. So it's almost like you have two different species utilizing two different sets of resources. And that is one of the things that's made advanced insects so successful evolutionarily, is that during one season, for example, winter, they can be underground as larvae, still active, but not exposed to the adverse above ground conditions. And then during the summer season, they can be above ground active when the weather conditions are good and exploit totally different resources. So this is a very big difference, and it has a lot to do with the evolutionary success and ecological success of advanced insects. Okay, I'm just going to go through some examples of New Mexico arthropods that you may or may not be that familiar with. Ones that we see very commonly are isopods. We have two common species of isopods in New Mexico. They're both exotic, they're both introduced. There are some native ones in the south, but ours are, as far as I know, the terrestrial ones are exotic. We do have native aquatic isopods in New Mexico. Then millipedes and centipedes, we have several different groups of millipedes. The large desert millipedes are the ones that you're probably most familiar with, but there are also many small millipedes that live in the soil that we don't see. And both millipedes and isopods are really important as far as being detritivores. Centipedes are a large group. We have the very large scolopendromorph centipedes, and then smaller centipedes, also a whole size range. These are important predators. Spiders, thousands of species of spiders in New Mexico, and hundreds of families of spiders. They're really a large group of arthropods, very important predators. Sun spiders, sulfugids, are related to scorpions. They're common here too. They're nocturnal, and they run around and capture prey. They have no venom whatsoever. They look ferocious, but they just simply overpower other arthropods and chew them up. And then we have several scorpions in the state. All of ours are not particularly dangerous to humans, unlike in Arizona. And they too are important predators that live on the ground and in the soil. And they're primarily common in the desert regions. And then if we look at some of the types of insects we have, ones that are more primitive, that have incomplete metamorphosis, include dragonflies, true bugs like stink bugs. Dragonflies and damselflies are predators. They can be very important predators in aquatic systems. The dragonfly and damselfly adults feed on flying insects, whereas the juvenile dragonflies, the nymphs, are in the water and feed on aquatic insects and even fish. So it's an example of where these guys have incomplete metamorphosis, yet the wing stage of adults, like the wing stage of stink bugs and grasshoppers, are able to fly, whereas the juvenile stages are not. And stink bugs include both predators and plant feeders. So some are pests, others are really important predators for insect pest control in gardens. Grasshoppers are a large group. I'll talk about those more later since I do research on them, but they're pretty much entirely herbivorous, and both juveniles and adults feed on plants. Praying mantises are important predators. They're probably not as important as people think just because of their popularity. Other types of insect predators are actually more abundant and do more predation than praying mantises do. But praying mantises are pretty spectacular insects, and we do have a number of species in the state. Darkling beetles are really important to tridivores. They're very diverse in New Mexico. These are the black stink bugs that people see. They particularly come out at dusk and at night. And then there are countless other beetles. I'll go through some more examples of these. Flies, many different flies, complete metamorphosis again. Fleas, we have several hundred species of fleas in the state. Actually a very large group. Many of them are very specialized to particular types of hosts, mammals, birds, and butterflies. Steve Carey talked about butterflies. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but a real important aspect of butterflies is that they do partition resources, like I mentioned. And then a sand wasp, representative of the Hymenoptera, other bees and wasps that have complete metamorphosis. And arthropods cover a wide variety of trophic groups. You know, you think of most groups of animals like birds, mammals, reptiles. They do cover different trophic groups, but arthropods cover even more and even finer partitioning within different trophic groups. So many are herbivores, like grasshoppers. The larvae of many beetles, butterflies, and moths are herbivores, and even many adult beetles are herbivores, and they have very important roles. Predators, lots of different arthropods are predators, mostly again, certain groups are predators, but even some groups that you wouldn't think of as being predators do have predators. So predation is very important, particularly in arid regions, and there tends to be a preponderance of predators in arid regions, and cannibalism is common in arid region predators to allow them to get through periods when food availability is low. Many scavengers, the darkling beetles, a lot of the other types of beetles in particular are scavengers of various types. Bearing beetles are really important for actually scavenging dead bodies of small animals, but they play a very important ecosystem role. Microarthropods all the way up to large ones in scavenging and enhancing nutrient flow through ecosystems. And then the pollinators are a very important group, which this whole series is about. And we've been emphasizing butterflies and bees, and they are indeed the important ones, particularly bees. And then parasites, but there are, I want to mention, there are other arthropods that are pollinators too that I'm going to mention a little bit later. And then parasites, there are many types of parasites. There's a whole category of insects called parasitoids because they are like parasites, but they kill their hosts. And there are hyperparasites, parasites on parasites. There are just countless parasites, mostly small insects, wasps and flies, but arachnids such as ticks as well. Okay, so that's kind of a just general overview on arthropods to give you an idea of just the diversity. And I'm going to show you some more examples in a minute, but I want to talk about the biogeography of New Mexico in the Southwest, because we have some of the highest biodiversity in North America, other than southern Mexico. And the reason for that is largely because we're located in the middle of the continent. So we are in an area where there are converging biogeographic or ecoregions that kind of come together in New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, from the east to the west and north and south. And so we get a variety of different ecoregions. And in addition, if you look at the topography of New Mexico, we have river valleys, we have mountain ranges, we have mountain masses, we have the plains areas, we have lowland desert. So we have a wide variety of topographic relief going from like around 4,000 feet in southern New Mexico to almost 13,000 feet in the mountains. So that allows for a lot of different types of physical environments. And when we look at the distributions, species richness of many insect groups, such as butterflies, the Southwest, particularly in New Mexico, has the highest diversity, the highest richness of species of anywhere in North America, north of Mexico. So again, these are all really important factors for adding to our biodiversity in New Mexico. And this map, this is a map of the biotic regions of the Southwest by Brown and Lowe. And again, you can see all the different biotic communities that are present in New Mexico. And again, we've got influence from the West, from the Mediterranean region, California, with a very different climate, and from the East, from the Great Plains, with, again, a moister and more summer rainfall regime climate. And from the North, and biogeographically in the past, much of the Eurasian migrations of species and groups of animals and plants have been from the north, from either the Bering land bridge or from a landmass in the North Atlantic at one time. So we get a lot of Eurasian species coming in over historic time into North America from the north, and then from the south, another set of biota has moved into North America. And so we're really in a great place for a mixing of all kinds of flora and fauna from different biogeographic regions. And, you know, you combine that with our variable topography, and we really are in a biologically rich region. Okay, now I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because I've already talked about the major groups, but I just want to show you some of the types of crustaceans that we have. For example, several crayfish. Most of our crayfish in the state are exotic species though, which is unfortunate. We have many types of fairy shrimp, amphipods, and I believe 2 species of tadpole shrimp. And the fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp are particularly important in the ephemeral ponds and wetlands of the shortgrass prairie. These species over dry period as eggs, and when water's available, the eggs hatch and they become adults very quickly and reproduce and produce eggs that can withstand long dry periods again. So again, we don't see these freshwater crustaceans because they're in the water. Most of them, other than crayfish, are small, but they are a very important component of our fauna in New Mexico and in the shortgrass prairie. And the millipedes and centipedes, on the right's a stone centipede, on the left is a scolopendra, the really big ones that get up to about 6 inches. And again, these are important predators, and the millipedes tend to be detritivores. Scorpions, we have many pseudoscorpions, which are a completely different group of scorpions, and they don't have a sting. They're very small. They feed mostly on mites. Harvestmen are a weird group of Cholicerates that are like spiders, but not. They're actually more like scorpions, and then the sun spiders are related to scorpions also. And then again, a wide variety of spiders. One of the really important ones in the prairie actually is a black widow. There are lots of them in the grassland. You don't see them. They're usually associated with rodent burrows, and that's where their webs are, but they are really abundant in our short grass prairie, and they eat a lot of grasshoppers. Other ones that are really important are the wolf spiders. They're large and they run down prey. They don't have webs. And then there are the orb-weave spiders. Crab spiders are really important predators of pollinators. There are many species of crab spiders that sit on flowers and plants and wait in ambush for insects such as bees. And then dragonflies and damselflies. We have the highest diversity or species richness of dragonflies is at Bitter Lakes down in southeast New Mexico. We have many different species of dragonflies and damselflies. The damselflies in particular tend to be very habitat specific. Some only live in large rivers, some in fast streams, some in slow streams, some only in ponds, some in small ponds. Dragonflies also partition their aquatic habitats, not quite as much as damselflies do though. But you can go to different environments and find different types of dragonflies and damselflies. And it largely has to do with the environment that the juvenile stages are living in. And then grasshoppers. This is the group that I work on. They're very diverse in New Mexico. New Mexico has the highest species richness of grasshoppers in the US. And I'm not going to go into much detail here. I'll tell you a little bit about it in some of my studies, but they are very diverse and there are different life forms in particular. And many grasshoppers utilize background camouflage, and they've evolved to live in certain microhabitats and even feed on certain plants based on their habitat, their microhabitat. We have many species of crickets. Jerusalem crickets are the large ones that people see and are afraid of. They're called child of the earth. They're totally harmless. They can bite hard. They have no venom. And then field crickets. We've got a number of species of field. There are about 8 species of field crickets in the state. By the way, Jerusalem crickets are still largely undescribed. Field crickets were just recently described. And we have scaly crickets that are related to field crickets. There's one species very common in the grasslands. And then different katydids, long-winged predaceous katydids, long-winged herbivorous katydids, and short-winged katydids. But they come in different colors and sizes and shapes. And again, they blend in with their background, and camouflage is very important. Grasshoppers tend to be daytime active, whereas most crickets are nocturnal or nighttime active. Cockroaches and mantises are diverse in New Mexico. We have particularly native sand roaches, several species, native field roach. All of these are native. I don't have any photos of the exotic ones, which we all think of cockroaches, but many of our species are native, and all of our mantids are native. There are some exotic mantids that are sold at nurseries that are becoming naturalized all over the country, but not so much in New Mexico because of our dry climate. And we have various stick insects, some that actually live in grass, specifically in feeding grass. Most of them live on shrubs, though, or trees. And true bugs, a wide variety, stink bugs, squash bugs. There are a number of aquatic true bugs like water skippers, water scorpions that are predators, leafhoppers, cicadas, aphids. It's a very large group of sap-sucking or predaceous blood-sucking insects. And then the beetles are the biggest group, of course, and very diverse. darkling beetles being scavengers, ground beetles and tiger beetles are ferocious predators. There are many types of wood-boring beetles, scarab beetles, a June beetle, a dung beetle, which is very important for removing dung off the landscape. And these guys are very effective, and they're quite common here. And blister beetles that feed on plants and are actually important pollinators. And then the Hymenoptera, the bees and wasps. And again, I'm going to go light on the bees because Olivia will be talking about bees on Thursday. So I'm going to emphasize more the wasps, but we have a number of different types of wasps. Most of them are hunting wasps. They're solitary, and they specialize hunting different types of things. They're, for example, the tarantula hawk wasp hunts tarantulas. There are many other spider wasps that hunt different types of spiders, like wolf spiders, and they range in size from tarantula wasps down to just a couple of millimeters, well, 3 millimeters, that feed on very tiny spiders. And then there are grasshopper hunting wasps. The blue wasp is a cricket wasp. This scoliid wasp feeds on scarab larvae in the soil. And then, of course, all the ants. So the Hymenoptera are a very large and advanced group of insects that include pollinators. And then butterflies. Steve Carey talked about butterflies, so I'm not going to spend too much time on those. But I think the important thing is to remember that the adults are nectar feeders on flowers, and the larvae are leaf feeders on plant foliage. The larvae tend to be more specialized than the adults. Often butterflies their larvae will feed on only certain plants, but the adults will visit flowers of many plants. And then flies are a very large group and very advanced, and they include predators, such as this robber fly that mimics a bumblebee. And this particular genus of robber fly actually specialize on bees, preying on bees. This is a more typical robber fly. Robber flies are probably one of the most important insect predators in the state, definitely more important than praying mantises. They come in all sizes, and they're out at different times of year, a really important group. Bee flies are an important group that they kind of mimic bees, but they're also flower feeders, but their larvae are parasites of eggs, grasshopper eggs, and other insects' eggs. And let's see, okay, now I've given you kind of an overview of the arthropods in the state, and that took longer than I thought it would. So I'm going to go through these studies pretty quickly, but I just want to show you some studies that I and some other people have done in New Mexico on arthropods to kind of show some of the main points. One study we did looking at ground-dwelling arthropods at LTER, long-term sites, at the Jornada LTER, the Sevietta LTER at Sevietta Refuge, and then up at Bandelier National Monument with the National Park Service. We monitored insects for 20 years. And these are some summary statistics on some of the findings we had. So overall, if you look at plant production from our sites, the Jemez Mountain sites in the forest had the highest plant production, okay? But if you look at the arthropods, this is many different groups of arthropods, beetles, spiders, grasshoppers, crickets, all kinds of things. We found that the Sevietta in the central part of the state had far more species than the Chihuahuan Desert site or the Jemez Mountain site, far more species. And that's probably due to the convergence of all the different ecoregions in that part of the state. And if we look at number of individuals, we also found that the Sevietta had far more individuals of arthropods than these other areas. And that We don't know why, but we believe it's because it was primarily in the grassland. The productivity of the grassland seemed to be more so than these woody sites, because the herbaceous vegetation in this climate is responsive to even small rains, we're guessing. But anyway, the important thing is in the middle of the state, in grassland environments, we get the highest number of species and the greatest number of individuals. And then looking at species composition of these arthropod communities, we found that, for instance, at the Jornada, we had a black grama grassland site. At Sevietta, we had a black grama grassland site. Based on species composition, all the Sevietta, the creosote bush site, the Jornada creosote bush site, the local species composition was more relevant to the location than it was to the vegetation type. So in other words, the Sevietta, with all the species and all the individuals, had distinct communities of arthropods different from Bandelier and even the Jornada that had similar environments. So the important point is our arthropod communities vary quite a bit across the state, even in similar, what look like similar environments, because of biogeography. And just looking at grasshoppers, I charted the number of species of grasshoppers across brown and low biotic communities in the Southwest. And I plotted just the highest ranking ones, which are over here on this chart on the left. The red areas are Chihuahuan Desert, had averaged around 100 grasshopper species. Then the desert grasslands between the Chihuahuan Desert and the plains grasslands is yellow zone, had about 80 species, and the southern Great Plains had about 80 species. So looking at grasshoppers in New Mexico, the greatest diversity is in the Chihuahuan Desert to the south and east, and then it transitions up into the Great Plains for the greatest diversity of grasshoppers. So it gives you an idea, and this is true of a lot of insect groups, particularly those that like open, relatively semi-arid environments. So one of the main studies that I've been working on with grasshoppers is long-term monitoring of grasshopper communities in different habitats or environments at the Sevietta. I started in 1992, and the study is ongoing now. And I'm focusing on how climate variation and climate change is affecting grasshopper communities through how it's affecting plant communities and plant production. So I'm not going to go into any details on this because run out of time, but I sample twice a year because different grasshoppers have two main life history patterns. There are some species that are adults in the late summer and some species that are adults in the early summer. So I have to sample twice a year, and I do visual transects, 50 meter by 1 meter strip transects. This picture down here is me walking a transect with a PVC pipe to flush up the grasshoppers. It's a method like bird ecologists use to do bird transects, but I'm in a fixed width and a fixed length of ground that I count all the grasshoppers in and by species. And you can see the kind of data I'm getting, and depending on the habitat, there have been some really spectacular peaks of often certain species are causing those. But I'm looking into what factors are causing different species to increase or decrease with increasing and decreasing precipitation and climate patterns. What I've found to be most important with the structure of grasshopper communities is what are called life form guilds in grasshoppers, a concept that was developed by grasshopper specialists back in the 70s. And there are in at the Sevieta and the grasslands in New Mexico, there are really 4 main guilds of grasshoppers that have different life forms. So if you think of plant growth forms like forbs, grasses, trees, shrubs, this is applying it to grasshoppers. So there are what are called graminecoles that live on grass and they eat grass. There are herbicoles that live on forbs and eat forbs. And you can see they look like the type of plants they live on for camouflage to avoid predation. There are a group called arbusticoles that are shrub specialists that feed typically on one species of shrub or one genus or family of shrub. And then there's a large group called terracoles. These are grasshoppers that just live on the bare ground, on soil. They do specialize on a type of soil, the texture of the soil, and they tend to be generalist feeders, primarily on grasses and forbs. And this list just shows the list of all the species I'm working with at the Sevieta and their different ecological traits. One of the things that I'm looking at now is climate sensitivity over almost 30 years of data for each species of grasshopper. And I'm not going to go into this, but basically by fitting grasshopper count data over a time series to different types of mathematical models tells you whether they're increasing and decreasing, in this case, due to a drought index that we're using as a climate variance scale. And we have climate variance that's wetter than normal, climate variance that's drier than normal. And over time, we look to see how different species are responding. So with 27 years of data on just this one species of grasshopper, you can see that this species has 2 generations of summer, an early summer generation and a late summer generation. So I had to look at both generations separately, and they're doing different things separately too. The early summer generation is affected very much by both drought and by too much rain, whereas the late summer generation is affected mostly by drought. And so even within a species, we see different responses between different cohorts within a year. And if we look at just linear trends over time, we find that in different environments, in the black grama grassland and creosote bush shrubland, the more desert environments, the species is gradually increasing over time. Whereas in the blue grama grassland, it's decreasing, and in a shorter period in the pinyon juniper woodland, it dramatically decreased. So we're doing this for a wide variety of species of grasshoppers and trying to understand how they're responding. What we're finding is you can't look at all grasshoppers together, pooled as grasshoppers. There's no pattern. It's insignificant. Even when I break them out into guilds, there's no overall pattern that's significant. I have to look at each species separately. And I think it's an important lesson for any type of studies in community ecology with arthropods. When you start pooling trophic groups or other ecological or taxonomic groups, you basically counter, one species will counter out what another species is doing, and you end up with no trend. So for those of you working on arthropod communities, really look at species, which is difficult to do because there's so many and they're hard to identify. We're also looking at diets of the different grasshoppers to help explain how they're responding to plants. And the main way we're doing it is just looking at gut contents and identifying plant fragments, which is actually quite easy to do. And we can look at how in different habitats, different species are feeding on which plants more than others. We're using selectivity indices. And we're finding that they do converge on certain grasses, like Guyetta grass is a favorite of many grasshoppers. So that indicates that there's competition going on. And we can also look at the mandibles of grasshoppers. Like other animals, ones that feed on grass have blunt teeth, ones that feed on forbs have sharp teeth, ones that have mixed feeders have intermediate teeth. So we can look at mandibles and also tell what kind of plants grasshoppers eat. Another set of studies, and so it's 4 o'clock, and I've got more to present. So I guess I'm going to ask Miranda and John, do you want me to stop? And
I'd like to hear about the prairie dogs and the K-rats.
Okay.
And someone's saying, a few people are saying, keep going, don't stop. So
okay, I'll pause at 2:15 in case I'm still going, because I do have some important stuff coming up. Some of the studies we've been doing, particularly I've been working with one of my former grad students, Anna Davidson, who now works up at Colorado State in the wildlife department and the natural heritage program. The roles of burrowing rodents in grasslands on grassland biotic communities. And what Anna and I have found is that when you look at a landscape, like this is at the Sevietta National Wildlife Refuge, all this bare soil in the foreground and larger grasses and a mix of plants is due to disturbance from both Gunnison's prairie dogs and banner-tailed kangaroo rats living here. And the pictures in the bottom left show a Gunnison's prairie dog mound with the disturbance patch around it and a number of forb species that you wouldn't find on the landscape that's grass dominated. And then on the on the banner-tail mounds, the same thing. So these disturbance patches are very important, providing habitat for early successional plant species and early successional arthropod species. So we studied at the Sevietta and at the Janos Biosphere Preserve, which is in Chihuahua, Mexico, south of Deming. And at the Sevietta, the prairie dogs are Gunnison's prairie dogs, and which are being reintroduced, and John Ers was involved in the reintroduction program there. But we're finding that they have a big impact when you bring them in and they increase the biodiversity. At Janos, we were working with black-tailed prairie dogs, which have larger colonies than Gunnison. And this photo on the top right shows the edge of a colony, and the grass is Tobosa grass. And you can see how it's grazed up to a point, and then it's not grazed by prairie dogs, and then there's bare soil and burrows. So again, you get this gradient of disturbance, and you get different species living across these gradients. And we did an experimental study at Janos with domestic cattle, kangaroo rats, and prairie dogs with exclosure arrays, and then monitoring the effects. And some of the things we found at the Sevietta and at Janos, with just looking at the mounds and areas, control areas where there aren't mounds, both, so on a landscape, we looked at a landscape where there are mounds and landscape where there aren't mounds. And then we measured right around the mounds for prairie dogs and for kangaroo rats, both at the Sevietta and at Janos. And we found we've got significant groupings of arthropods, plants, and grasshopper species in the different environments or microhabitats created by disturbance by prairie dogs and kangaroo rats, very pronounced. And for our study at Janos, which was with Gerardo Ceballos at UNAM and a number of Mexican colleagues and people from the Jornada Experimental Range. This was our overall model, and our experiments with the exclosures was set to test these, but the grasshoppers, I focused on grasshoppers, which were this one part of the overall model, which are the animal associates. And again, we found that when you remove prairie dogs and kangaroo rats and fence an area without them, we get significant differences in many groups of animals, but particularly grasshoppers. And if you remember back to the life forms I talked about, that was mostly because the grasshoppers, the graminecoles that are species that live on grasses, when the grasses are grazed down by other animals, those go away and they're replaced by terracole grasshoppers and herbicole grasshoppers that like forbs and bare soil. And we saw that over and over again. So it just emphasizes how disturbance is very important in creating these disturbance patches with transitions of ecological succession with different species. Now, we also studied fire at the Sevietta, and this is, again, John Ers is involved in fire management at the Sevietta for grasslands. And this was a natural wildfire, but again, wildfire in grasslands is a natural disturbance that is very important in creating biodiversity by creating patches of different ages of ecological succession. And we looked at all groups of arthropods in this study. And this was, Robert Parmenter was the lead on this. I looked at grasshoppers and crickets. We found that the dark bars we had unburned and burned areas compared. The slash bars are unburned areas. The dark bars are burned areas. The fire arrow shows when the fire occurred. In general, crickets, which live on the ground under vegetation cover, went away after the fire. And grasshoppers, some species, again, the terracoles and the herbicoles came right in, and the graminecoles disappeared when the perennial grasses had burned off. And then other studies, I've got another fire study with grasshoppers. Once the perennial grasses like blue grama and black grama come back, the graminecoles come back. So you get a shift in the grasshoppers over time again. So it's another form of disturbance. Okay, and I just want to mention that I've started working at the Rio Mora National Wildlife Refuge with Brian Miller, and we are monitoring grasshopper communities at Rio Mora Refuge now, like at the Sevietta and like at the Jornada. So we have an array of sites from the Chihuahuan Desert to the southern shortgrass prairie, where we're looking at how grasshopper communities are responding primarily to climate change. But at Rio Mora, we're looking at grassland, pinyon juniper, and riparian areas. So overall, my summary then for the grasshopper ecology, and I think this applies to many other insects, and I know it applies to reptiles and small mammals too. Dryland grasshopper diversity is very high. The highest in the country is in our region. Life form guild structure is very important, and we find it consistent in the process pattern consistency among different disturbance studies. And it just emphasizes that natural disturbance processes in our grasslands increases the diversity of arthropods. Okay, I'm gonna just quickly, do I have time to go through some of the, I'm just gonna show some of the non-insect pollinators and then talk about habitat restoration.
That sounds great.
Okay, I'll try to get through this fairly quickly. So I mentioned earlier that most pollinator insects are the more advanced insects, the holometabolous insects. And of all the insects, arthropods, other arthropods, and all insects, if we look at an evolutionary tree with a time scale, this is all based on DNA analysis. Of all these other arthropod groups, the only ones that are really important pollinators are the Hymenoptera, the bees and the wasps, the Coleoptera, beetles, and the Lepidoptera, butterflies, and primarily moths. And these are all insects that are quite advanced. And another important thing in an evolutionary time scale is most of these advanced insects that are pollinators evolved during the Cretaceous period when angiosperm radiation occurred. So that's when flowering plants first started taking off. And in fact, coevolution with insects was an important reason that angiosperms radiated because of pollination. And then the KT asteroid hit right about when that was happening and kind of reset everything. And so a lot of the, particularly the lower or the finer resolution taxonomy like species, genera, and tribes have largely evolved in the last 50 million years or so, whereas all the bigger groups evolved back 300 million years ago. So just to give you perspective, the important pollinators, Diptera, I forgot Diptera, are all advanced insects. So I'm not going to say much about butterflies because Steve already covered butterflies, but I do want to mention that moths are very important, particularly the hawk moths or the spingen moths. They pollinate deep corolla flowers like 4 o'clocks and datura. And many of these moths are the main pollinators for deep corolla night blooming flowers. So they are an important group. And then another group of moths, the noctuids, the cutworm moths, many adult cutworm moths are also important pollinators. Other moths tend not to be that important, but then there's the classic example of the yucca moth and yucca flowers too. So don't forget moths. We see butterflies, they're beautiful, they are very important, but so are moths for nocturnal flowers especially. And then bees, I'm not going to say much about bees because Olivia is going to talk about bees on Thursday, but it's important to just keep in mind there are some big groups of bees, and I'm sure Olivia will talk about this, but honeybees are not native. All these other bees are, and bees tend to be much more specialized in the flowers that they visit and also in their nesting requirements. So habitat is really important for bees. So wasps don't get much attention as pollinators, but they are important pollinators, and particularly the hunting solitary wasps. So wasps like hornets and yellow jackets are not pollinators. They feed on meat primarily, so they're carnivores, but hunting wasps like spider wasps, like our state insect, the adults feed on nectar. They visit flowers during the day and they transport lots of pollen. They're generalists for the most part, but there are a lot of them. They're out at different seasons through the summer, and they are important pollinators, but not like bees. And then beetles, they tend to get overlooked, but there are some groups of beetles that are really important, particularly blister beetles, meloids. They eat flowers, but they also have hair on their faces and they collect lots of pollen as they go from flower to flower, and they don't always eat the entire flower. They just eat a few petals or a part of a petal, then move on. So they pollinate. Jewel beetles or depressed flat-headed wood-boring beetles visit flowers in the daytime, and they fly from flower to flower. There are certain flower scarab beetles like the peach beetle and tumbling flower beetles that visit daytime flowers. They're not that common, but sometimes the tumbling flower beetles can be, and they do visit a lot of flowers. Soft-winged flower beetles, Myriapodes, visit flowers in large numbers, often in the early summer in particular. If you look at flowers, see all these little beetles running around. It's those and sap beetles, Nitidulids, which also feed on the nectar, and there'll be large numbers, and they move from flower to flower. Also, tumbling flower beetles, Mordelids, are important. Cerambycid beetles visit flowers, and checkered beetles, which are predators for the most part, also visit flowers. So these groups of beetles, if you see a beetle on a flower in New Mexico, it's likely one of these. So keep these in mind as being important. And then flies always get overlooked, but there are some flies that are really important pollinators, particularly the hover flies or syrphid flies. These flies are bee mimics. They tend to look like bees to avoid predators, and they feed on flowers. Their larvae are predators of aphids on plants. So they're really good flies to have around, and they're fairly common. Bee flies are another group of flies that look like bees but are not, and they visit flowers, and their larvae also are parasites or predators, but the adults feed on flowers, and they are hairy and transport a lot of pollen. Tachinid flies are a family of parasitic flies, a very large family, and the adults feed on flowers. You particularly see these guys up in the mountains. And in fact, in mountainous regions like the Southwest, like in New Mexico, when you go high in the mountains, the temperatures are too cold for many bees. So usually you're down to bumblebees and tachinid flies. You'll see lots of tachinid flies on flowers high in the mountains. And then there are some apiocerid flies are specialists on flowers, but they're pretty rare. So anyway, keep bees in mind. Keep flies in mind as pollinators too, but only certain groups of flies. Okay, so now it's 1:15. Should I keep going? I'm getting near the end. I'm not gonna have time for questions though.
I think I think everybody's engaged in this and would like to keep going. Someone asked a question about the difference between flies and bees, but it looks like Jade covered that in the chat. So I think we're good if you want to keep going.
Okay, again, I'll try to move through I'm near the end. I'll try to move through quickly. So there has been a lot of news in the last few years about global insect declines, and it is for real. It is happening. However, it's happening more in some parts of the world than others. There was a recent a recent issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It just came out this year that has a whole series of articles on global insect declines. These are some of the articles that were in that issue that I pulled out because they're very relevant to what we're talking about. I recommend that you look at it. There were a series in 2019 of articles that came out too. The bottom line is that, like birds, there's bird decline happening, other animals throughout the world. Arthropods also are being greatly affected by habitat loss primarily, and it's primarily due to agriculture and urbanization. So as we clear the land for agriculture or building, we're essentially removing habitat. So therefore, the individuals and species that live there are declining. And that's what we're seeing on a global basis. So it's primarily habitat loss, and it's primarily Western Europe, and it's primarily Eastern North America. New Mexico so far is not, as far as we can tell, suffering any big declines, but some species are declining because of climate change alone. So if we look at the main parts of the prairie, we're in the western short grasslands on this map. The top shows kind of an idealized natural prairie ecosystem. And what we're essentially doing on a large scale is converting that to cropland. And if you look at the pie charts on the bottom, compare 200 years ago to now, there's a big difference. We've gone from natural prairie to agriculture, primarily fields, corn, soybeans, cotton, various crops, which we need. So it's an issue. If you look at a map of land cover of North America, if you look at New Mexico on this map, the yellowish is intact grassland. If you look across the border in Texas, the brown is agricultural development. Go up into Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, and all through the upper Midwest, it's pretty much all developed as agriculture. So keep in mind that New Mexico is really in good shape compared to other parts of the Great Plains as far as habitat loss. And that's something very hopeful for us. This is a map produced by the Nature Conservancy. It just shows distribution of numbers of federally listed threatened and endangered species in the West. And you can see that there are a lot of them. And just as an example of what this has done, we used to have a locust in North America called the Rocky Mountain locust, Melanopus spretus. That species is now extinct because of human activity. An entomologist named Jeffrey Lockwood at Wyoming studied these, and he's looked at specimens, DNA, and he and other people have concluded that species was a valid species. It is now extinct. When Americans were first colonizing the Great Plains, these grasshoppers bred only in the river valleys on the Front Range of the Rockies, from Alberta all the way down into Colorado. And those river plains, the flood plains along the rivers, were the first places that settlers plowed for agriculture. It just happened, those are the places where this species had to breed. And like the passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet, this species, for behavioral reasons, needed to be in large numbers. So when agriculture took out its breeding areas in the foothills of the Rockies, the species went extinct and we didn't even know it. And it used to occur all the way down into Mexico. And these guys just covered the landscape. I mean, the swarms were incredible, similar to the desert locust in Africa. But that species is now extinct since the early 1900s, inadvertently, because humans developed its breeding habitat. So it can happen, and even to something like a locust. It's just amazing. There are several other endangered insects. I worked on surveys of these, and I learned a lot doing the surveys. The Dakota skipper, which occurs up in the Dakotas and Minnesota and into southern Canada, is a species endemic to the tallgrass prairie. Its larvae only feed on certain species of slender stem grasses like little bluegrass, and the adults are only present for a couple of weeks a year, and they have to have certain nectarine species of plants like prairie coneflower. So when those are taken out, they don't have food for the larvae or for the adults, and the species has been declining considerably since the 1950s. And for example, some of the things I observed is that in prairie habitat, there are a lot of forbs like milkweed, and the adults feed on the flowers of the milkweed. So, you know, obviously when you turn the area into corn or soybeans, there's going to be no butterflies. And that's a big part of the landscape. But a lot of the landscape still has remnant prairie grass, but the farmers use the grass for forage for cattle. So many of the remnant prairie areas that I went to on surveys had been recently sprayed with herbicide to kill the forbs, to encourage the grass for livestock. So therefore, there's no forbs for the butterflies or anything else. And so this top center picture is a recently sprayed remnant of tallgrass prairie, and you can see all the forbs are dead. The bottom center picture is another remnant tallgrass prairie that's got a lot of alfalfa and sweet clover and mostly all exotic grasses. And the top right is a heavily grazed area of remnant prairie that's also herbicided. And then the bottom is seeded, it's remnant tallgrass prairie seeded with timothy grass, and it is also dominated by other exotic non-native grasses. So even though there's a lot of remnant tallgrass prairie in some places, it's not natural tallgrass prairie, and many of the plants are gone. Many of the native plants that insects and other animals rely on are gone. The Pouching skipperling is another species that now in the northern plains is reduced to a population in Wisconsin, one in Michigan, one in Minnesota, and in Manitoba, Canada. And in 2019, when I was up surveying, the species hadn't been seen in the US for 10 years and is thought to be extinct in the US now. And it used to be all through this area. And again, these butterflies, the adults need certain flower plants for nectar. The larvae need certain grasses for food. The flight period, 2 to 4 weeks. The adults, individuals live 3 to 10 days. And they spend the rest of their life as a larva and pupa in the grass. And their habitat's gone. So their population is basically crashed. So my overall message then, based on my experience with habitat management and restoration for prairie arthropods, there is a need. We're losing a lot of our prairie, especially the tallgrass prairie. And what we really need to do is manage existing natural landscapes for native species. We need to enhance resource management of natives over non-natives. There needs to be more of a balance between commercial, agricultural, and natural resources. And somehow, I'm not sure how, but we need to create more incentives for commercial private land use for resources that favor native habitats and species, such as conservation easements, tax breaks, things like that. You know, when you think of it, most of the prairie is private land. And unless we can work with landowners, it's not going to happen. We need to restore degraded habitats as much as we can for general biotic communities that pollinators are part of, particularly plant species. We need to target certain species and particularly those components of the biotic communities that are necessary resources for those species. And we need to incorporate special status species with other land uses as we can, instead of just the other land uses. And the other thing is we need to manage for natural disturbance processes. In addition to restoring natural biotic communities, we need to restore or mimic processes that keep different stages of ecological succession present. Most communities are temporary and they change over time. We need to include that in restoration. And we need to consider the ever-growing impacts of global warming and climate change. We're seeing that big time in New Mexico with increasing drought, warmer winters, just a whole group of problems happening. And seek and interact with organizations that support insect conservation, particularly the Xerces Society. They're really good. That's what they do. If you go to their website, you can find all kinds of information on restoration for pollinators in particular. So, you know, work with NGOs and friends groups, things like that. Wow. Okay. I was just going to go through a quick example of a restoration project that I did, but I'm out of time. I want to, again, highlight also any public lands and working with public lands. So we have the Kiowa National Grasslands. We've got the Federal Fish and Wildlife, Northern Complex Refuges, Rio Mora, Maxwell, and Las Vegas, Capulin Volcano National Monument, the Southern Plains Land Trust in southeastern Colorado, and the Turner Ranches. The Turner Ranches have been so beneficial for New Mexico for conservation. And my summary then of the whole thing is our grasslands do have naturally high diversity. There are a lot of patches, there are a lot of natural disturbances, and there are huge conservation needs. We need more education. We need to work better with politicians, and we need to work more with land management agencies, federal agencies, state agencies. And we need to practice restoration practices that are based on what was there, what the goal of the restoration is, and include time to restoration. Remember, most habitats that we're restoring are a serial stage of ecological succession. So if we go in and restore it, what's going to happen over time? Do we maintain it at that serial stage? Do we let it go to another? You know, we have to include disturbance dynamics with restoration. So that's it. And I'm sorry I went over.
No, Dave, thank you. That was amazing. That was very informative, and we're seeing a lot of comments that it was a great presentation. You're an engaging presenter. So I think everybody, you know, that stuck around was really wanting to learn all this. So it's great.
Well, I would be happy to stay and answer questions, but I know the time is up and people are going to want to go. So
I think you did such a good job that there weren't a lot of questions. But if anybody wants to put anything in the chat for any questions, please.
Oh, and someone said, don't apologize for sharing your wealth of knowledge.
Sorry, I went over. No, people, I'm very happy to answer emails too. If you Google University of New Mexico Museum of Southwestern Biology, Arthropod Division, I come up. You can email me. I'd be very happy to exchange emails, answer questions, talk with people. So I guess
someone does want to hear about the restoration project, if you're okay with talking about it still.
Yeah.
And then a question related to that is, what is the impact of herbicide use to remove non-native plants before doing a restoration project?
What is the impact of herbicide applications on non-native plants? Is that the question?
It says to remove non-native plants, so maybe on the insect community.
Oh, I understand. My take is, if at all possible, use manual removal of non-native plants. And of course, it's going to depend on the size of the project. A really good example, the Whitfield Nature Center near Belen, New Mexico, had this problem. And what they found worked really well was simply mowing. They had a lot of kochia and salsola in the areas they wanted to be grassland. They mowed repeatedly for 5 years. I think it was about 5 years. And eventually it reduced the seed bank so low for those non-natives that the native grasses took over. But they had that same dilemma. And the example that I was going to go over about the Candelaria Nature Preserve, that's what we decided too. Avoid using chemical herbicides because they kill native plants as well. And if you do need to use chemicals, target them very specifically or use them only in the very early stages of restoration, and then switch over to manual removal. But obviously, if you've got 100 acres, manual removal is going to be extremely difficult. So, you know, most restoration projects are individually unique, and you really need to come up with the plan that's going to fit a particular project based on the size of the project, the time frame of the project, and the resources that you have, and what kind of community do you want to end up with. So that was a long answer, but I'd say avoid using herbicides as much as possible. Any other questions?
Not that I've seen. Someone has done the mowing to reduce seed, the non-native seed banks. John, do you see any other questions?
I don't think so. I think you've talked about the restoration projects you've been working on. I think that's it. I learned a lot, and I think that I think you did. Oh, wait, we do have one. Effects of prescribed burns on our ecology. I think that's just a general question. So maybe it's saying what are the effects of the prescribed burns on our ecology?
Oh. Everyone.
Just that one.
Okay, so I'm sorry. Would you like me to answer Patricia's question?
Yes, that'd be great. And she did clarify the effects of prescribed burns on insects and pollinator ecology.
So using prescribed fire totally depends on the system that you are in. So some ecosystems are not fire adapted, and prescribed fire is not necessarily the best thing to do. For example, the Rio Grande Bosque, there's a lot of restoration happening there, but fire was never historically a disturbance component of the riparian ecosystem. So prescribed fire is not really appropriate in bosque restoration. Also because the exotic species respond very well to prescribed fire, salt cedar and kochia and salsola. But in a grassland system, a ponderosa pine system, a system where the species have evolved with fire, then use fire as it naturally occurred in the system as much as possible. So like in ponderosa pine, I know I'm getting away from grassland, but wildfire occurred typically every 5 to 10 years on the surface and kept the forest open. So in ponderosa pine in New Mexico, prescribed fire about every 10 years is a good thing. But in pinyon juniper, fire really isn't a good management tool because it's just not a fire adapted system. Grasslands are fire adapted, and fire, I think probably, actually John is probably more of an expert on this than I am because he has used fire as a management tool at the Sevietta, but I believe it's about every 5 years or so. Is that right, John? So if you want to use
5 to 10, depending on the system here. We're getting more, 5 to 10. We're getting more arid, so it might be a little bit longer now. But yeah.
Yeah, and then the size of it's important, and the severity is important too. So you want to burn when it's not going to be unnaturally severe, like not when it's really hot and dry. You want to burn when it's going to have beneficial impacts, not detrimental impacts. So, any tool that you use for disturbance to mimic natural disturbance really should mimic that process in the natural system, both in space and time.
And I think one thing that maybe Patricia was asking, and I think you mentioned it, is that when you put fire on the grassland, that changes the diversity for that grassland. So, the natural fires, you'll create a patchy mosaic. And so you'll have some areas that are burned and some that are unburned. And when you have that, that means different species come up from the succession, right? So you'll have the 4 species, as you mentioned, and that's where you were saying after fire, you were seeing different species, like you didn't see the Graminicals, is that right? And then as they came in, you saw them as the grass came in. So it sets things back and it creates that diversity in the species of vegetation, then that affects the diversity in the pollinators too.
Yeah, I think for overall diversity, having a variety of patch patterns of disturbances at different ages is going to result in a landscape with the most diversity. So, any restoration project really does depend on a number of factors, and time and space are really important. How big is the restoration project? How long is it intended to be maintained or managed for? Those are important questions that need to be answered first, and then figure out the tools that fit. Anyone else? No, looks quiet. Oh, no, there's some. Oh, you are very welcome.
And thank you, Jade, again for answering that question. Jade's she's another bee expert that has done a lot of work down at the refuge. We have a question from Janice about where are your restoration projects? So
the big one that I've been working on is in the Rio Grande in Albuquerque, the Candelaria Nature Preserve, which is right next door to the Rio Grande Nature Center. That's one that I just finished. And I'm also working on forest restoration projects in the Manzano Mountains, looking at the effects of tree thinning and fire, natural wildfire on vegetation, soils, hydrology, and animals. So mostly along the Rio Grande and in the mountains.
Awesome. I think it looks like they're kind of dwindling down. A lot of thanks from the comments and myself. This was fascinating. But I think with that, since the questions have slowed down, we'll wrap it up. On Thursday, we have our last one with Olivia Carroll. So we'll see you all then.